Okay, now we know that the Old Testament period ended with Israel back in the land. The temple had been rebuilt, and they had become a nation again, and they were under the King Herod. Now an interesting thing occurred, and prophecy begins to take effect again. And what happens is, in the year 3 BC, two boys are born. One is born to Elizabeth and Zechariah, and the other one is born to Mary and Joseph. Now Mary was approached by an angel, and she was told that the Holy Spirit would visit her, and she would become pregnant, and she would have a son, and he would be called Emmanuel, and she was to name him Jesus. And the angel visited Joseph and said, "Don't worry about it. We know that your wife has been faithful, but she's been visited by the Holy Spirit, and you have nothing to fear." So both these children were born, or were actually born in 3 BC. Now John was actually born 6 months earlier, and when John became of age, he began to preach that the kingdom was at hand, and he began to baptize believers in the Jordan River, and he told them that the baptism was a requirement for salvation, and they should wait for the Messiah. Now Jesus, when he was a young lad, when he was first born, he was born in Bethlehem. The angel visited Mary and Joseph, and she said that the Herod knew the prophecy of the Messiah being born in Bethlehem, and he was going to have all the young males under 2 years of age killed. And so he told the Mary and Joseph to flee into Egypt and come back when Herod is dead, which they did. When Herod died, Mary and Joseph, instead of going back to Bethlehem, actually went to Nazareth. And Jesus grew up in Nazareth, and when he was 30, which was considered the legal age to be a priest, he began his journey to John the Baptist. And he met John the Baptist in the Jordan River, and he was baptized, and John the Baptist recognized him as a man of God. He wasn't quite sure yet that he was the Messiah that they were looking for, but he baptized Jesus, and when he did, the Holy Spirit descended on Jesus, and the Lord said, "This is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased," thereby certifying that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. Now Jesus was immediately led by the Holy Spirit into the desert to be tempted by Satan. And for 40 days Satan attempted to tempt Jesus into abandoning God and accepting Satan as his Lord. Of course, Jesus refused. Now, this was the same Satan that had managed to corrupt Adam and Eve, but he failed to corrupt Jesus. So after the 40 days, Jesus immediately began his ministry, and he began walking through Galilee, preaching the kingdom was at hand. And during this his ministry, he selected 12 followers that are known as the apostles as witnesses, and they followed him through the land as he healed the sick, and he gave sight to the blind, and he raised the dead, and he cured lepers, and he preached the kingdom was at hand. And as Jesus became more powerful and he gained fame, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and the Sadducees, the political leaders, became concerned. The political leaders were concerned because it might affect their position under Roman control, and the Pharisees, they feared him because he was preaching a gospel that was contrary to theirs, and so they plotted to kill him. Well, finally, after about 3 years of ministry, they did manage to grab Jesus, because one of Jesus' disciples betrayed him to the Pharisees, and he pointed him out to the garden while Jesus was praying. And the temple guards took Jesus from the garden, and they took him to Caiaphas's house, who happened to be the chief Pharisee at the time. And they took him there by night, which according to Jewish law was illegal, because in the way it had to run was typically they had to arrest him, then he had to appear before the full Sanhedrin. But in this case, they never went to the temple. They went to his house, and Caiaphas and some of the Pharisees questioned Jesus, and they determined that he was blaspheming and he had to die. But they couldn't kill him because they needed to be tried as Sanhedrin, and all the Pharisees had to be part of the trial. So what he did was he sent Jesus to Pilate, or the Roman leader, and he told Pilate they wanted Jesus crucified. And Pilate questioned Jesus, found no fault in him, and he sent him to Herod the great son now. And Herod couldn't find any fault, sent him back to Pilate, and Pilate told Caiaphas that there was nothing there that would convict him, and to be executed. But the Pharisees insisted, and they wouldn't even accept a trade in prisoners. And so Pilate did as they commanded, because he was afraid if he didn't, a riot would ensue, and that would be difficult to contain. And so he had Jesus scourged, and the following morning at 9 o'clock, they crucified him. And he hung on the cross for 6 hours until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he died. And he was taken down by a man named Joseph of Arimathea, who donated a tomb, and Nicodemus, the Pharisee that Jesus had actually talked to earlier. And he was buried in the tomb just before the Passover. And he lay in the tomb until Sunday morning. Now the tomb had been guarded for the 3 days because the Pharisees were afraid that his followers would steal the body and then claim that he had risen. And so they posted the guards, and in spite of the guards, the tomb was thrown open and Jesus was resurrected. Now that morning, Mary Magdalene was walking by the tomb, and she saw that it was empty. And there was an angel there that told her, said, "Why seek ye the living among the dead?" And Mary and her companion were running to the disciples to complain that they thought that someone had stolen Jesus' body. And then Jesus appeared to her and identified himself, and then Jesus appeared to the disciples, and he demonstrated that he had truly been resurrected, and he was now there in their midst. And Jesus taught his disciples for 40 days. And after 40 days, he was taken up to heaven. But before he left, he told them that to stay in Jerusalem, for he was going to send a Comforter, or the Holy Spirit, that would sort of accompany them throughout their lives, and from that point on. Now, the interesting thing to remember about Jesus' crucifixion is that he died on the day that the 69th week, or the 483rd year, had passed out of Daniel's prophecy. The Messiah was cut off on that particular day, or that day of crucifixion. So what happened at that point was the time that God dealt with the Jews had ended, and there was now a new covenant, and that new covenant was with the believers that believed in Jesus Christ, and this was the beginning of the church, and the Jews were sort of left in the background. Now, after the Holy Spirit descended on the disciples and the people that were with them, they all began to go out in the streets and preach, and many people were saved and believed in Jesus. And this continued from that point on. Now, 3 years after Jesus' resurrection, there was a Pharisee named Saul that was on his way to Damascus to arrest these new believers, and he was intercepted on the road by Jesus within a bright light. And Jesus told Saul I'm going to call you Paul now, and you will become the disciples of the Gentiles. And that's your mission. And then he blinded Saul, and 3 days later he restored his sight, and Paul immediately went into Arabia, and he dwelt there for 3 years while he was instructed by Jesus. After the 3 years, Paul started his ministry, and he went up and down. He met with both Jews and Gentiles, and he was talking about Jesus. Now the difference between Paul and the Apostles' Gospel was that Peter, James, and John, which were considered the elders, they preached essentially that you had to be a Jew and believe in Jesus Christ. So they preached that you had to obey the law, that you had to be circumcised, that you had to be baptized, and that you had to believe that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. Now Paul's gospel was simpler. Paul taught that by grace are you saved, and nothing. There was nothing else you could do. It was simply by grace. Now this caused conflict between Peter, James, and John, and the other apostles, and Paul. And so after a number of years, 14 years after Paul's first visit to Jerusalem, he met with the elders again, and they determined that truly Paul had been given a revelation by Jesus Christ himself, and he would become the apostle to the Gentiles, and Peter would be the apostle to the Jews. And Paul went on 3 missionary journeys to Asia Minor, and to consisting of Turkey and Greece. And on the 4th journey that he went as a prisoner of Rome, and he was in Rome awaiting execution, as well as Peter was also there. And they were both executed pretty close to the same time. At this point, the New Testament ends. But there is one more book in the New Testament, and that's the book of Revelation. And that deals with end-time events that have not occurred, but are anticipated, perhaps in our generation. It was written by John on the island of Patmos. And there were certain events that took place, or that will take place, one of which is that God will again deal with the Jews for another 7-year period. But up to that time, God will deal generally and mainly with the church, those believers that believe in Jesus Christ. And prophetically, there was an event that Jesus predicted, and that was that Jerusalem, or that the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed, and that the people, the Jews, would be scattered throughout the land. And they were. When Titus came down in 70 AD and destroyed the temple and sacked Jerusalem, all of the inhabitants were scattered. And during that war, many, many hundreds of thousands of people died. And the rest were all scattered into the Middle East and into Asia Minor and to Rome. And the second event that Jesus predicted was that Jerusalem would be trodden down by the Gentiles until the end of the Gentiles. Now, both of those events were predicted, and both were predicted that they would that Israel would once again live in its own land, and that occurred in May 15th, 1948. It's predicted in the book of Ezekiel. And in 1967, Jerusalem was again in Israel's hands when they defeated the Jordanian army in the War of 1967. So those two prophecies have come true. The next event that the church is awaiting is actually God coming and taking the church away. And once the church is gone, then God will again deal with Israel for the following 7 years. So once the rapture occurs and all the believers are taken up to heaven, at that point the 7-year timetable starts again for the Jews. During that time period, a great political leader will arise in the world and will have great influence in the world. He will be accompanied by a great religious leader. They will work in conjunction. And in that time, he will make a treaty with Israel for 7 years, guaranteeing their safety and allowing the temple sacrifices to begin. During that time also, God will miraculously reveal himself to 12,000 of each of the 12 tribes, and they will go through the land and proselytize the people and tell them about Jesus' saving grace. Now, during this time period, there will be wars, and it describes wars with the kings of the east, and Gog and Magog and Persia, and certainly the current world events sort of seem to lean towards that direction. But they will be defeated, and the Antichrist will no doubt take credit. And after he rules for 3.5 years, or the mid of the tribulation, he sets himself up as God on the temple, and he will be assassinated, and he will die, and live in state for a while, for 3 days, and then be raised up, and then he will actually initiate the final 3.5 years known as the Great Tribulation. And during that time, God will pour out his wrath upon the people of the earth. And it will be a terrible time. Billions of people will die in very gruesome ways. And the Antichrist will pursue the Jews, and he will torment them. And any new believers, he will torment them. It tells us in the Bible that they will be headed for their belief, and there will be innumerable numbers that will suffer. And in 3.5 years, the conflict will increase to the point where Jesus himself predicted that if God himself, if Jesus himself didn't come down and put an end to it, the entire world would destroy itself. And God does come down, Jesus does come down, comes down with his church and puts an end to it. And he takes the false prophet, or the false religious leader, throws him into the lake of fire. All the unbelievers go into the lake of fire. And Satan gets cast into a bottomless pit to be bound for 1,000 years. And Jesus will set up his kingdom in Jerusalem with all the now of the believers and the church. And he will rule from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. And during those 1,000 years, there will be peace on earth. And the lion will lie down with the lamb, and the wolf lie down with the lamb. And children will play with poisonous snakes and not get hurt. And there will be plenty, and the world will repopulate itself again. And at the end of 1,000 years, God will again release Satan, and Satan will tempt the world, and there will be some that will turn to Satan. And the moment they do, God will destroy them, send them in a lake of fire, and this time Satan himself will go into the lake of fire. And then God, or Jesus, sets up the great white throne judgments. And all those people who were not found in the book of life that had been written before the foundation of the world was laid are thrown into the lake of fire. And only those that are believers will remain. And at that point, God will create a new universe. The old will have passed. And will create a new earth, be regenerated. And millennium, and infinity, will begin. And mankind will never have to worry about sin again. Thank you very much.